In speaking with our customers who are looking at Microsoft Azure, one of the very first workloads that they bring up is disaster recovery. Maybe they're in the middle of looking at a large acquisition of on-premises storage, or maybe they've just heard how great of a platform Microsoft Azure is to secure their environment and make sure it's always on, it's always available. In this session, Protecting Your Infrastructure with Azure, we're going to discuss disaster recovery, and in particular, Azure Site Recovery, ASR. Everybody's talking about it. Let's learn quite a bit about it. Presenting today is George Scott, one of our cloud strategists here at Planet Technologies. George?
Thank you, Steve. Very happy to be here and to talk about this technology. It's kind of near and dear to me because I began my career in support. And we're going to talk about data protection and how you might protect your data center using Azure and giving yourself a second data center. Obviously, we know that if you have a problem with your data, there's a huge impact to your business. We've seen that several times over the year. There's an impact to your brand, which is even more important with some of the high-profile names that we've heard that have had problems in the past. And then down on the lower level, an impact to an IT career. Many people have had to move on, even in the CISO roles, because of issues. We know that if you get an issue seriously enough, that it can shut down your entire business. So being protected is very, very important. And Azure gives you some great options to be able to protect your data center. So today we're going to talk about two different technologies that are available. The first is Azure Site Recovery, which Steve mentioned. This gives you the ability to actually provide complete disaster recovery for virtual machines and physical servers, either to Azure or to a second data center. Works either way. The second is Azure Backup, and Microsoft has their own Azure Backup software in a couple of flavors that we're going to talk about, but there's also the ability to use third parties to just back up into Azure as a secondary backup instead of using a tape backup system. And in the cloud itself, for your virtual machines that are in Azure, there's pretty much one-click backups that you can set up to protect your virtual machines, either in that data center or in another region entirely. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Azure Site Recovery, or as we call it, ASR. As I said, you can do failover to Azure or into a second DC. Most people use this to go up into Azure. It has failover going to and from Azure, so you can replicate virtual machines or a physical server up to Azure. And in the case of virtual machines, we can easily replicate them back. So if you want to replicate them up to do a QA or a test scenario, you can bring them up there, and then you can bring it back as needed. Automated VM protection, so obviously using Azure automation, we can protect virtual machines and set up orchestrated recovery to go back. Using Azure Security Center, we can do remote health monitoring that'll give you, on-the-minute checks to make sure that replication is working. It's also very, very easy just to simply test the rollover. So with Click, you can click over and it'll simulate a rollover in the background and let you know that you've got everything set up workingly. You can orchestrate the recovery of both the machines, but in some cases we can get more complicated and actually have something like SQL that needs to be recovered too. So we can recover the whole application tier instead of just the virtual machine, all done by Azure Automation. And as I mentioned before, it does support heterogeneous environments, so it's not just Hyper-V, it fully supports VMware as a Tier 1 client. On the other side, we have Azure Backup, and this has been around forever, being able to back up stuff. We've all done that personally. We've ran backup servers. We've run tape mechanisms and had to deal with tape forever. This gives us a very cost-efficient way of doing second-tier backups, and even gives you the advantage, because it's so efficient, of reducing the amount of data that you have to have on site. Commonly, some people hold data for 45 days on site and then have a tiered backup for tape backups. I've seen people go down to 30 days and even 15 days on-site data because it's so easy to bring that data back from a cloud technology like Azure. We can do backups with on-premise VMs. We can back those up into Azure. We can do just a simple workload. I've actually got my laptop that just gets backed up into Azure easily. And then in the cloud itself, we can back up virtual machines very easily with one click. The backup software that comes in Azure is application aware, so it knows what Exchange looks like, it knows what SQL looks like, it knows what Linux is, so it knows how to back up these different workloads. And as I said, we can reduce the dependencies of having on-premise in. There's two different ways we can back up, or actually three different ways. I mentioned Azure Backup for a single client, but we can also back up using centralized software using Azure Backup Server, which is free. Okay, or if you own the System Center suite of products, there's Data Protection Manager, which will give you all the features of Azure Backup Server, and in addition, allow you to back up the tape. So you could do two sets of the second tier and third tier backups. So maybe you do archive out the tape, but then you have a shorter archive out to Azure. So then this begs the question, if we're doing replication with Azure Site Recovery, and we're doing backup, which is which? When do we need replication? When do we need backup? And you would think if I'm doing replication of this virtual machine, say it's a file server, and it's being replicated up into Azure, and I've got a copy of all that data, maybe I don't need to back it up. But the deal is, if that machine gets compromised or a virus gets on it, that is going to replicate into Azure. So there is still a place for backups. So the idea is that you'll use replication, Azure Site Recovery, to replicate your virtual machines, physical servers, and give you on-demand recovery. So we can easily just fail a machine back over if that machine fails, if you have a hard drive failure, if you lose data, something like that. But in the case of being hit by a virus or something that really knocks your data so that it can't be recovered, we have a backup that we can actually get to that data. So you need to use both. And you set up replication for the machines, and then the data that you need backed up gets backed up. So what do I do now, moving forward? How can I test this? As I said, Azure Backup, just a single server backup, is as easy as downloading it onto your Windows machine, Windows 7, Windows 10 supported, or if you've got a server, you could easily just download Windows Backup and just test out how easy it is to go to a cloud. I do that every day. It's very easy to set up Azure Backup Server. As I said, that software is free, so you can just download it, set up centralized backup server, and then just back up your virtual machines into the cloud. If you've got IaaS VMs, we can easily back those up with the touch of a button, and then you set up your retention policies and how often you want them backed up. Okay? And then we have quick start offerings to get you started on Azure Backup Server or Data Protection Manager. On Azure Site Recovery, I would say that's a little more difficult to set up. If you're using Hyper-V, it's fairly easy to set up. If you're using VMware, a little more complex, but still works very easily. Planet has quick starts to help you get started on those. I've got this slide here that many of you have maybe seen before, and it kind of draws out how this works. So I know, and I apologize in advance for it being such a busy slide, but I think it's really important to be able to see the different types of business continuity and disaster recovery. So you can see that this would just be an on-site backup, and normally, prior to the cloud, we would just set up some type of data protection manager that would back up this infrastructure to a backup server, and maybe there would be a SAM replication that would replicate that over to another data center, right? But in today's world, when we have Azure, we can add to that and not have to have that second data center. We can use Azure as the second data center and not have to ship tapes off to a second location. So in its infancy, the very simple stuff is what I was talking about. A single server, or maybe you're responsible for servers in each individual environment, and they're maybe at local bank locations, and there's just a server that you need to back up. You could easily use PowerShell to install Azure Backup Server or Azure Backup and just back those up to the cloud. They have nothing to do with centralized backup. Just every night they're backing up, and you've got a copy of them and you can get to that remotely. So very simple backup. Then we can implement either Azure Backup Server or Data Protection Manager and work with the backup servers and still back up all the data that's on premise, whether it's SQL or Exchange or SharePoint. It's all application aware, so you just tell it what you want to back up out of those, and it'll back it up both locally and then also in the cloud. So you have a copy of local data to get to for, say, 15 to 30 days, but then if I need something, I can get to it out of the cloud very easily. And it's not like a tape where I've got to load up a tape. There is a product that Microsoft has called Store Simple. That's a device that you install that will tier data, so we could use that. Or more in the modern thing that Microsoft has come out with is Azure File Sync. that you can add to Windows Server and sync files up into Azure. So that's another way of getting data up into Azure. And then we can also use Azure Site Recovery, SQL Server to do always on. So we're replicating our SQL database out to Azure and having always on. We can flip back and forth between Azure to do disaster recovery. And then using Azure Site Recovery, we can replicate either VMs or a physical server up into Azure and obviously be able to go back. So again, I know this is a busy slide, but I think it draws out the story quite well, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And now we'll go to our panel discussion led by Steve Winter.
Great presentation, George.
Thank you.
Who knew you could do so much? So I want to introduce our panel. First, Aaron Ward. Aaron's a cloud strategist here at Planet Technologies. Ali Khan. Ali, welcome back.
Thank you.
A solution specialist in public sector for Microsoft. Pete Seidel. He's a federal lead here at Planet Technologies, and Jerry, a cloud strategist here at Planet as well. So Ali, I want to start with you. DR, government customers, Azure, how are you seeing this coming together?
Well, I'll refer back to George's presentation. It was very good. The obvious use cases are virtual machine backups, et cetera. But one of the other use cases that we're seeing with Azure Site Recovery is a lift and shift as well. If folks want to go ahead, customers want to move into the cloud, ASR is a very good technique of moving infrastructure into the cloud and also converting physical machines to virtual machines. So it's a P2V model as well. And the obvious use case is when they just want to have a constant replication of virtual machines and use the cloud as maybe a backup or a tertiary site. And on top of that, the other thing that we're seeing also with customers is the flexibility of having a tiered storage. So depending on how many times they're going to retrieve the virtual machines, they have the flexibility of putting it in a cool blob storage versus hot blob storage, which from a cloud economics perspective really gives them that flexibility.
Yeah, so Aaron, jump on that from an economics perspective, because in your earlier presentation, you talked a lot about process and standardized processes around that. We didn't get a chance to really jump into the economics in that, but what Ali just laid in is a perfect example of where you might want to use that process to discover those economics around DR, right?
Exactly. So depending on how you're managing disaster recovery, whether that is an active-active type of environment, active-passive, there's definitely some financial economic gains that can be made by depending on what strategy you go with. And sometimes depending on your data classification and what data tenancy in Azure is required, it could be almost 50% cost savings going to a cold storage model.
Wow, 50%.
Over the hot, yes.
Yeah. So Jerry, how are you seeing it manifest in your customer base?
A considerable amount of time is spent not on the economic justification, but just really prioritizing what you're going to do first. Our time is spent helping folks understand the process and also the priority of which they're going to take after first. Everybody wants to go after low-hanging fruit. Low-hanging fruit isn't always the first thing you want to attack. It's understanding the priorities of the things you want to go after first. And we spend a considerable amount of time doing that with folks.
So when we start looking at, okay, so we've got this tool, Advanced Site Recovery. I can use it for backups. I can use it for migrations. I want to start doing economic assessments and understand that, but I want to look at the big picture. You know, George, what are some of the things we might want to start saying to customers who say, hey, look, I've got $500,000 ready to invest in on-premises hardware for backups. Like, what are some of the positionings we want to be, what are the things we want those customers thinking about?
For backup, the idea is that you can use Azure Server Backup or Data Protection Manager to back up into the cloud at a very economical way, and you don't have to worry about the tape backups anymore. That's historically what people have used. And they're traditionally insecure. We've all seen the stories where the person had them on the bus and left them on the bus and they were unencrypted. Or you're shipping them off and you need them back and you've got to get that person to ship them back to you before you can even restore the data, right? So by putting the data in the cloud, you literally, in the backup software itself can say, I need that file back, restore it. And depending on how fast your network is, you've got that file back within a minute or two, to get that file back. So instead of even having to mess with having to keep this tape backup software and the equipment that's done, up to date and working and then store those tapes off site, it just works. So what I see is customers that are running into end of life on their tape backup solution, and they want to use a better way of doing it. And as I said, this could be done with third-party backup software, and, just as easily as it can be done with Microsoft's first-party software. So it's economical, and you don't have to maintain the equipment that's on site, and you don't have to ship the tapes off site, and you get the same benefit.
If I could add to that, Steve, is traditionally tapes have a high failure rate. So even though that you have them off site, the big thing is when you get them back, they probably won't be working. So your data retention policies are just out the window at that point. The other aspect, we think about disaster recovery. Real disaster recovery means that there's a significant distance between you and your backup, your on-premises data center, and where that backup exists because of natural disasters, like what we just seen with the Carolinas, what we're seeing with overseas in Japan. If your data exists in your same on-premises data center, or what most people do on the other side of the town, you lost not only your data center, but you lost your backups. So leveraging the cloud like Azure Backup enables not only fidelity of your backups, but also enables you that distance that you need for a true disaster recovery scenario.
I'll add one more to that. I know customers that have to spend a week to 2 weeks every year testing their disaster recovery solutions. They fly to Pittsburgh or wherever the site is, and they go up and they do a full week or two test. And this is several engineers. High cost to do that. And that's a once a year to test. So with this technology, you're literally pushing a button and you know it's working. It's within your grasp. You don't have to fly anywhere. Microsoft's taking care of all the hardware. So you don't have to go visit that site and make sure the hardware's still working.
And you're quite literally testing that almost every week, because when somebody says from a retention policy perspective, I'd like to get that data back. It used to be as you described it, but now it's like having a nearline system far away from a cloud perspective. That nearline backup is accessible and immediate or near immediate. So the idea that you have to do it every year is just beyond the comprehension today. Now I'm doing it once a week just based on my general operations. Somebody says I need content back, or I need to make sure I can have this in the next 6 months for retention reasons, then it's there. It's a nearline backup.
So let me change. I'm going to come back to that because I've got a lot of follow-up, but I want to change directions here just a little bit to you, Pete, because you come from the application side of this. So how are you seeing Azure and ASR help in the disaster recovery and backup associated with applications?
Well, application uptime is king. You got to have your HR apps up, you got to have your finance apps up. Anything that isn't up is costing companies money. So when you use ASR to ensure that everything is backed up and replicated reliably, you can bring down those files that have failed, or you can bring back the databases that haven't worked before, or you can make sure that your system and your pipeline is continuous, that all of this effort that you spent in getting DevOps set up and running is not completely cut off and interrupted because it takes you a week to have somebody hand deliver backup files from Seattle to Annapolis. So, it's really good to make sure that you can get access to what you need in order to recover it quickly, and ASR gives you that.
And how many times do we see the dev department, the SQL people, the people that keep the applications actually running, have their own backup strategy, right? That IT knows about but isn't in charge of, right? This gives you the way of merging those two. SQL's as easy as going in and running some commands to back up into Azure. Not saying you do that, but that's how easy it is to do it. And then add SQL always on, the functionality like that. There's no need for that, the shadow IT anymore.
And it stays
the
within the
SQL group.
operational model that way.
Exactly.
It'll save you cost as well. 'Cause,
Right.
you're taking large terabytes worth of database and you're storing extra copies on your SAN. That's eating up space.
Right.
Right.
If you get rid of that and move it all to the cloud, it's cost effective.
And I think that's really, I love that you brought that up, George. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because just like in one of our earlier sessions, we were talking about planning to the cloud, these become so infrastructure-focused dialogues that sometimes we forget that in many cases, the most critical component of our IT infrastructure is our application environment and our ability to develop applications and deliver these applications to our customers. I'm so glad that you brought that up. So that brings the question, and I'll open up to the panel, that brings the question, how do we create that dialogue? How do we help our customers create that dialogue and stop saying, hey, I'm just shipping ones and zeros to here to there. Hey, I've really got this operational environment that includes everything in my IT data center. How do we create that dialogue?
A lot of times it starts from a retention policy, legal retention requirement. Those conversations generate this dialogue. Other conversations generate the dialogue just purely from a disaster recovery planning perspective. Both of those discussions kind of lend themselves to this dialogue, and it gives us an opportunity to kind of open up their understanding of what's in front of them. Again, a lot of what they probably already own and aren't utilizing, but the idea is that it is a lot simpler than they probably perceive it to be today. So our ability to open up the dialogue, have that discussion, say this is really where your path should go as you're moving to the cloud, and utilize the feature functions that are available to you.
Unfortunately, sometimes it could also be folks having an actual disaster.
Yeah.
You know, something goes down and you
No,
you actually
That's when stuff gets done.
That's when it gets done fast.
that's
you
when
miss
it gets
reporting
done.
to the street
When the
or
budget's
something.
open.
Something that's you know, a big issue. Then you know, executives start looking down at it and say,
Yeah.
well, what did we do wrong?
Yeah, and I was going to add, Steve, that the dialogue for us starts a lot with the what are the pain points? What are the internal SLAs that IT departments have to meet with their own customers, right? And a great point that you folks raised regarding the tabletop exercises that folks used to do and actually simulate a disaster has become so much easier with the cloud. So all those combined, that starts the dialogue. And then on top of that, you take it to the next level, which is what is your IT staff trained on? What platform? What storage solution are they trained on? What backup storage are they using today? Are they using NetApp or EMC, Dell? Are they using Commvault or Veritas? And Microsoft's done a really good job at integrating a platform as another target on those existing platforms so they don't have to retrain their IT staff.
That's a great point. So we talked a lot in this presentation about ASR and the functionality that brings, and it's a great solution. But a lot of our customers have an investment that they want to continue on. They have a great relationship with that third-party provider, and maybe they want to continue on with that. How does that work with Azure today?
Well, it's the same thing. It's basically that these investments have already been made. So these software solutions or the SAN solutions already integrate with Azure. As long as they have some kind of network connectivity built in, like ExpressRoute or a VPN tunnel, et cetera, then it can just ride off, piggyback off of that connectivity. And then Azure is just another backup target.
So these
based on those policies.
These lack of mutual exclusive discussions are really, really important for us to have with our customers. Stop thinking of it as on-premise versus cloud. Start thinking of it as, to the point you were bringing, hey, is my data center geographically desirable, right? I mean, do I actually have a DR plan, and can I test it? And these things, ASR is a great tool. We want our customers to take a look at it, but if they're invested in something today, like make sure that it's got Azure plugins, make sure that it works with Azure so you can gain all these benefits.
Correct. That's exactly right.
So one of the other things is that both ASR and backup provide, especially for industries that have a lot of compliance requirements, like CGIS. It's a mandate of they have to have a mandatory failover of their whole entire data center once a year. And the problem with that is that that's very costly. It requires a secondary data center to be live. It requires operations to move and migrate and be live. Versus with Azure Site Recovery, we have the ability to simulate. And with that simulation, fulfills CGIS compliance requirements, which is huge. Same with Iris 1075 PubSec, being able to provide that true disaster recovery, not just plan, right? I know every customer, I can go ask their CIO, do you have a disaster recovery plan? They say, yes, we do. Do you have an execution plan? No, we don't. And this enables that.
And are you seeing that in the federal customers, Pete?
Absolutely. COOP costs are expensive to making sure that your environment is 100% or 5.9 uptime. You have to have that in place. I mean, there's regulations around it, and implementing like this in the federal space is going to be a huge improvement.
The real irony is the uptime requirement is impacted by the testing.
Right.
So the testing that Aaron just talked about gives us an ability to fulfill the requirements and do it in a simulated fashion that doesn't affect the uptime whatsoever. And that really does help us drive through the usage of the platform from a testing perspective. It really helps out.
I'll throw one more thing in. Think about your environment that's sitting up there that you've got simulated up there. Isn't that just a QA environment? I mean, I was in charge of a development one time, and I had to have a QA. I had to have pre-production and then production. That can all be done easily with ASR. And you don't have to run it all the time. You don't have to buy the hardware. It's just sitting up there. I know one customer that whenever they get their updates, they actually update the copy that's up in Azure first, and test it to see if it works. And then they'll do their production environment. Okay?
So I want to go back to one of the earlier questions I asked, but I really want to dive in on really, really specific customer scenarios. So Aaron, you and I have been discussing a customer who's, has a budget right now for a significant amount of hardware investment to handle their DR. You're taking them through a conversation to look at maybe potentially redirecting that budget towards an Azure commitment. Talk to me a little about that discussion and how you're kind of working the customer through that and what the benefits and maybe not the benefits are.
No, appreciate that. So, the customer is looking at doing a significant hardware investment plus software investment. And keep in mind, that's like, going ahead and saying you're investing in a vehicle, right? It just depreciates from the time that it hits your data center. It's, you only have a limitation of 3 to 5 years before it's written off the books, and now you're having to make that reinvestment again. The other aspect is they were looking at backup from a perspective of that this is a need because they're outgrowing their current backup solution. I always tell my customers that the cloud is about infinite capabilities with infinite resources, where your on-premises data center is finite resources with finite capabilities. And that customer had this ability to, the interesting part is when we were doing the first cost analysis, not just the apples to apples comparisons of whether it could be a viable solution, but beyond that, getting to the cost estimates, it actually turns out that they were looking at a significant cost reduction by adopting cloud versus reinvesting in traditional backup and hardware. So that customer is actually now full-blown working with Planet to let's move forward instead of this being a general conversation to let's engage in Planet help us move not only our operational efficiencies from on-premises to cloud, but also mentor us, help us establish that initial architecture, and also let us have cloud readiness enablement for Azure.
So in the federal customers that you're working with, are you seeing that they mapping DR into their Azure strategy, or is it more like a separate strategy, right? So what I mean by that is, are they just looking at DR as a workload, or are they looking at DR as one of the Azure workloads that they're looking to adopt? And are they planning it the same way, or are they planning them differently?
That's a very good question. I believe it's in their enterprise cloud strategy. So DR is a huge component, as we've talked about. It's a very critical component of the enterprise. So when they look at their overall and overarching cloud strategy, DR is a big component of that from an application standpoint as well as infrastructure resiliency.
That's great.
Yeah.
I want to take the conversation a little bit back to ASR because I want to dive in on one of your original comments, right? So not only is ASR great for this, backup, but it's also great from a migration perspective. Does anybody kind of want to jump in on that and talk a little bit about that?
So it's the easiest way to get servers or virtual machines into the cloud. It's really easy to set up, and you replicate it over, and you turn off the replication, and you're in Azure. Okay? You could leave the replication on. Microsoft doesn't even charge for the first 30 days.
Yes.
So if you get the replication going, you replicate your VM up there, turn it off within 30 days, you don't even have to pay for ASR. You're just paying for compute and storage.
Well, the other advantage though that ASR though is that it also provides you that template to right size the
Yes.
VM correctly. So a lot of times what
very
happens is we have in our VMware or Hyper-V clusters, we have some type of application that has been overinvested in compute and memory, and we have historical information about it, and now ASR will right size it as well as provide us the capability of knowing what that compute will cost us on a monthly basis. So ASR is a great tool, and like you mentioned, George, it is a no-cost add-on for the first 30 days that Microsoft provides to customers that are looking to migrate.
Ali, I want to come back to you because I think it's important to discuss Store Simple because 2 years ago we might have been having this conversation really diving down onto Store Simple. So where does Store Simple fit into, from a Microsoft perspective, into this strategy?
Store Simple has a very specific use case. It's it's an appliance that gets, as George mentioned, that is on premises, and it is a quick and easy way to get content into it that'll just target the cloud. So it's very simple to set it up. It's basically a rack server, and it has a very specific use case. Where it lacks a little bit is around creating policies and getting a little bit more complicated, sophisticated things in there as far as retention and things like that. But we have seen some healthcare customers actually adopt StoreSimple, invest in it, and target the cloud as a backup solution.
It's great.
Yeah.
So a little bit about planning then. I just want to ask one final question about planning, and open to anybody who wants to jump in. Okay, I love this. This sounds great. ASR, Azure, maybe I'm going to integrate it with my current backup situation. Where do I start? How do I start?
I think the big thing for customers on how to start is to not have that paralysis anymore. Engage with your partner, which is Planet. We are here to help, and we're here to get you through what most of our customers go through on a day-to-day basis, trying to over-analyze this whole entire solution. Having your environment assessed to determine what can move, what can't move, and then also what those budgetary costs are very valuable to moving you forward to a backup of the future today.
And if you're going to do anything on Azure Site Recovery, make sure you pick a workload. Don't just test it. Like pick something like a financial system that we were talking about earlier, and make it work. And then do a test failover and say, how long did it take us to fail over and make this work up in the cloud, right?
Yeah. The value of a production workload is one of those first tests is you can't put a number on it. You have to be able to do something in production to be able to fail over and show that you can do it in order to gain the confidence both in the client as well as in the team that's doing this on a daily basis. Their operations have to do it. All across the board, they have to understand what it looks like in production and how to manage it throughout the process in order to be able to gain that confidence, say I'm going to do much more of this.
So for me, I just want to say that for me, I keep coming back to this point, and it seems to be consistent across all of our sessions. It's time for our customers to start not just expecting more from their partner and from Microsoft, but being able to receive it, right? We're here, we have to be here on this cloud journey to help you make these decisions moving forward. These platforms are changing, they're becoming more functional every day, but there's a great opportunity for us to work together in order to kind of build the plans today, get those production workloads in there and test quickly and easily today, build plans today. Hey, let's make sure that our data center is actually outside of our geography, and we can do that today, and we can even test that for you today. Guys, great session, great panel. I think we brought a lot of value on this topic. We look forward to working with our customers on this.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
With me is Jerry Martin, George Scott, and Aaron Ward for the live Q&A and panel. So just like the other sessions, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom. Please go ahead and click in and ask any questions that maybe weren't answered in the session or where you might want to dive deeper. So the first question I have come in that I think was covered fairly well, but I want to address it again is, certainly ASR is great for disaster recovery, but there's a question around what else can it be used for. So George, you want to capture that? Oh, I think maybe we lost them. Aaron or Jerry, you want to address it?
Yep. I think I'm back on.
Oh,
Jerry,
good.
you want to take a stab?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Jerry. So
Sorry, my video froze, so I wasn't really sure. So I'm sorry, Steve, all the technical questions.
So ASR, great for DR. What else can it be used for?
Well, as I was saying in the video, I think one of the key things that we look at it from other workloads outside of disaster recovery is more around retention policy content that needs to be both saved for a period of time, but also recovered on an ad hoc basis. A lot of our clients are looking at it from a recovery perspective for retention policies. It's a really big conversation, not just in recover an old email. It's not in the online archive, but also on content. Some of our legal customers, a lot of our medical customers, looking at it from a recover of content to retention policy recovery of content.
Going one step further, being able to build environments out in the cloud instead of having to go buy, as Aaron said in his session, when you build out an environment, it's like buying a car or a house, right? You're having to buy very expensive servers. You're having to maintain those servers. You're having to maintain the drivers and firmware on those servers, it's very, very easy to set up an environment in Azure and take it back down. So if you've got a QA environment on premise, instead of having, a pre-prod environment, you can replicate that QA environment over to Azure and have both environments without having to maintain them, and then tear that environment back down as it goes. Having an environment up in the cloud using ASR, you can take that offline into its own network and be able to update it to test monthly updates or any kind of patches as it goes, and then replicate that down on premise. And then last but not least, you have the ability to take an environment, move it up into Azure when you need more horsepower, and then bring it back down in a couple of weeks or whatever. So maybe you have that end of the month payroll or whatever that for 5 days a month, your servers are really taxed. And the rest of the month, they just work fine in the on-premise environment you're already paying for. It's very easy with Azure Site Recovery to move environments back and forth.
Okay, terrific. Next question. Oh, go ahead, Aaron.
I was going to add to that real quick is that ASR is actually a great tool to be the migration factory for an organization, because of if I'm looking at ASR as a tool to help me migrate into Azure, it really enables me that low to no cost tool to be able to do that. So I mean, everything that you need from the methodology aspect of lift and shift is built into ASR, such as, I need to analyze this workload. The workload will be this type of cloud fit for, what is needed in the sense of compute and memory, and also hard drive space, which then that's the beauty of ASR, is once you have that workload down to its exact compute, etc., you get your budgetary number for that workload down to the pennies. That will cost you on a, whether it be per hour cost, per month cost, per annual cost, it doesn't matter. But again, it's the migration factory tool that we would recommend every customer be leveraging.
Okay, great. There's a question here, guys. It was stated that costs for ASR can be initially delayed for 30 days, but are compute and storage costs immediate? Can they be initially delayed until what conditions? And there's also a tie-in here in the question around MSDN. So I'm not sure who wants to address that, but
I can do that. So from an ASR perspective, how this has worked with Microsoft is that the tool itself, unless it's been ran from day 1 to day 30, on day 30, if that tool has been run, then you're charged for the tool accordingly for that VM for that month. Realistically, if you're utilizing ASR strictly as a migration tool, then your migrations usually are anywhere from, from the time that you initially start doing the ASR templatization to full migration, and then production cutover is well below 30 days. Some workloads can be within a few hours. Other workloads might be a week, because if you're doing extensive testing to ensure that when we move that up there, we're not going to have any client connectivity issues or any other type of workload dependency issues we weren't aware of. But unfortunately, from a compute and storage cost, the compute doesn't occur until ASR has actually migrated the compute from on-premises into the cloud. So meaning that typically when we're utilizing ASR as a disaster recovery tool or a always-on tool, or basically our true DR aspect, then the only thing you're really paying for is the storage. And so the storage is hot storage. So depending on which Azure tenancy that you're in, whether it's the commercial tenancy or the government tenancy, there is a price difference between those two for hot storage. But that is actually all you pay for, and that's going to be whatever is the average hard drive space that's being leveraged with ASR. The compute itself doesn't actually charge you until you leverage compute within Azure itself. So the great examples of that would be is if I needed to do, like we heard in the video, is that I need to do a test failover. So I need to ensure that our workloads move from on-premises up into Azure and that they come up correctly, but we're not going to simulate a full DR aspect. We just want to make sure that everything comes up and we're getting responses. You would pay for that compute for that 1 hour. If that's 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours that you might have that up and running, and then you go ahead and say, okay, let's shut that down. But you do pay for storage on annual or on a monthly cost. And then the other question I think was the MSDN, Steve. So MSDN does provide customers with $150 per month of Azure Compute. You can take that developer license and combine them together and throw them into a subscription tendency for billing. So if you were thinking about that, we want to leverage 3 or 4 MSDNs that we have, and we're going to combine those together. We're going to use those for the minimum amount of storage that we might be leveraging within ASR that would actually cover that. It might be, I don't know if there's a cost benefit to that per se, because of that's more of like a commit model, meaning that I've already invested my money ahead of time, and then if I don't use it, I lose it for that month. So it doesn't mean that if I had $150, I only use $50 out of that, $100 rolls over to next month. I lose that $100 for that month. So I'm not sure if MSDN would be the most financially, fiscally way I would go from a production standpoint. I'd probably do more of a pay-as-you-go.
Unless you already own 4 MSDN subscriptions and had that laying around.
Exactly. If you're not using it, I agree.
Right.
So we have a next question, guys, and you mentioned the templates a little bit, Aaron, in your response you just made. But does ASR or Azure Backup have templates which can help agencies keep compliance with data retention policies?
That is a great question. So from that perspective, the templates that would be created does allow you to do the data retention in the sense of how long do I want to hold a certain amount of backups that we're doing for on-premises into Azure itself. ASR itself, though, provides us really with the mechanism and the whole methodology on how to provide near to zero downtime, meaning there is always downtime, but being able to at least achieve the 99% that most customers want, and maybe even 99.9% uptime that customers would like to get with an on-premises to cloud DR perspective. Within Azure Backup, you do have that capability of doing retention policies. So if I have, let's say we have a 7-year retention policy and we only want to hold backups, maybe it's that we're doing nightly backups, but we're holding 4 weeks worth of backups during a month, and we're holding 1 month backups for a year, and then only holding annual backups up to 7 years, and then we're truncating that off accordingly. That is actually something configurable that you can do within the Azure Backup retention policies capabilities.
And tier that among the storage, right, Aaron? Like
That is correct, between hot and cold storage, yep.
So we have a little more of a technical question here, so I'm not sure if we have the panelists here can address it. Maybe we might need to follow up on this, but we're using the Azure Backup for Azure file shares and Azure VM. We are also backing up SQL from a file share. How can we make this more efficient and use less disk space?
Well, I can tackle that one too. So that's a great question. So when we're thinking about Azure Backup for file shares, your biggest thing is when you're using file shares that you want to make sure you're deduping, right? And most organizations do dedupe, whether they're on a Windows NAS device or a third-party NAS device, you want to dedupe. When we're getting into backups within Azure, one of the great things if once it's in Azure, it actually does differential at the bit level for backup. So your first initial snapshot is full snapshot, and then everything that changes within that VM is bits. The other aspect, though, from a SQL, you may want to, depending on what version of SQL Server you're leveraging, if you're using SQL 2016, you may want to start looking at some of the new capabilities for Azure Backup or even Azure SQL for high availability. So there's some really good new benefits to SQL 2016 customers that enable us not to do the traditional log shipping that we used to have to do into like another SQL database architecture or even Azure SQL, but now we have the capability of doing SQL replication up to Azure SQL. And the benefit there is that Azure SQL is very cost effective. You can purchase it based on DTUs if we're just utilizing it strictly as a backup or a low accessed database. So that way we can quickly pull information from those tables back into our on-premises environment. Or if I want to look at it for a full DR, I can actually do more of a hosted core model, meaning that this is the type of performance that I would need if we flip over from a disaster recovery. So some great solutions there, and the benefit there is obviously once you throw that into Azure SQL has it's one of the few services within PaaS that automatically provides you your backups, automatically provides you 99.99% uptime. So hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Aaron. This is an interesting one to tackle from both Office 365 and ASR, Azure DR perspective. Can Azure Backup be used to back up Office 365?
I got to tell you, we had this question a couple times with a few of our clients, and honestly, one of the first questions we asked was why. Only because Office 365 has its own secondary and tertiary backup routines in itself as a part of the platform. So one of the things we wanted to do is try to understand what the real question was behind that question. In a lot of cases, it's making sure that they have access to information from a recovery perspective in a more near-term fashion. So I guess in that specific question, I would ask, outside of having a secondary and a tertiary backup capability or recovery capability within 365, what else really are we looking for? I'm trying to answer a question with another question, I realize, but it's scenarios like that gets us want to dive in deeper.
Well, actually, one scenario might be, though, could be that if we're trying to figure out how to, maybe we don't have a compliance situation where we need to put them, a user that has left our organization, and we don't really want to maintain their mail in Office 365 anymore because we don't want to pay for that license as an aspect. One option could be is that you're leveraging Azure file storage or backup for PST file offloads. That might be an example. But again, that would be leveraging PowerShell scripts to dump the mailbox and its archive out to a PST and then uploading that into Azure File Blob storage, so that way it can be in cold storage at that point, which then you'd be able to pull out and do whatever you want to do for a retention and compliance standpoint. But like what Jerry was saying, most customers at that point just put it in a legal hold and are done with it so that we don't have to deal with the compliance situation. And it also allows them to search.
If it means something outside of mail, a lot of times this question focuses on mail, but if the question comes up and it's outside of mail, whether it be team data, SharePoint data, and the like, once again, I think Aaron just answered it. What we try to do is figure out outside of the infrastructure backups that are already provided with the service, if you needed that data somewhere else, specifically for what we call our dearly departed users from the organization, then we typically use blob storage for housing that in a cold scenario or a warm scenario that allows them to have recovery capabilities for it, and then have solutions for grabbing that back when they need it.
I was just going to come around, Steve, and say, just to answer the question flat out, no.
No. There you go.
George, we can always count on you to answer something flat out.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, thanks very much for the panel. Thank you very much to our attendees for their really strong, quite great questions. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes until the next session. The next session and the last one of today is Advanced Security Options with Microsoft M365. That's going to hit right at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, 11 o'clock Pacific Time. That's the last session for today. Reminder that we do have a full slate of 3 sessions tomorrow, and you'll of course be getting a reminder of that from our team to make sure that you know what times and schedules, and we'll be addressing that right at my wrap-up remarks at the end of the next session. But please make it back for 2 o'clock, Security Options with the Microsoft M365.